Yo, what's up, everybody? Welcome to Magenta Edge, a T-Mobile for Business program created to educate you, entrepreneurs, small business owners. This is session 1 of 8. So, for the next 8 weeks, every Thursday, there will be a new course taught by a different instructor that will cover a different aspect of the business. Okay, so this is the first session of 8. This course is all about smart storytelling for impactful marketing. If you want to see the full lineup, if you want to see the articles, access resources, you can visit tmobile.com backslash magenta edge. Again, that's tmobile.com backslash magenta edge. T-Mobile will also be live tweeting throughout today's session. So if you want to join the conversation, if something sticks out to you, or you just want to ask questions, you can go join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag Magenta Edge. So as I mentioned, this lesson is all about smart storytelling as the key to impactful marketing. So as we get into storytelling as a key for impactful marketing, why do we say this, right? We're all a brand. As people, we're brands, and so are our companies. Why is that? That's something that we don't control. A lot of times we talk about, building your brand, or do you want to build your brand? How do you build your brand? But it's really something you don't have a choice to do. Your brand ultimately is the lasting impression that you leave on people, right? It's what you or your company symbolizes or represents. It's what you consistently do, right? That represents your brand and what you symbolize, right? So when we think about that, at the same time, consumers are people first, right? They have real needs, real desires, real values, real interests. So the key to connecting with people is seeing your brand as a person, right? So it's humanizing your company, humanizing your brand. So understanding that your brand has a personality, your brand has values and interests. If your company was an individual, who would it be? What would you have to say? What would you care about? What needs and values would you offer, right? So as we think about that and we get into smart storytelling for impactful marketing, a lot of it will be thinking about and approaching storytelling through the lens of real human connection, real people to people connection, and seeing your audience as people you're actively having conversations and engaging and connecting with to ultimately create community, create conversion, and drive better business results. We are live throughout, so I will be clicking through. And as I said, there will be a space for you to ask questions at the end. So just feel free to ask your questions as we go through. Right? So smart storytelling for impactful marketing. About this course. So this 3-part course is going to teach you the mechanics of building impactful brands through smart and effective storytelling. And I'm going to get into what I mean by smart and effective throughout. So then here's a little bit about me. My name is Julian Mitchell. I'm the founder of IQ Labs. So for the past 10 years, I've run a parallel between being a brand marketer and being a multimedia journalist. So as a marketer, I've created campaigns and content for brands like Honda, Wells Fargo, Google, Beats by Dre, the NFL, Amazon Studios. And at the same time, I've been a columnist for Forbes covering entrepreneurs and startups, the business of media and entertainment, while also being a columnist for HuffPost, contributing to Vanity Fair, MTV News. So the ecosystem of my career has been driven by storytelling, right? Telling stories in different platforms, different formats, different spaces about different topics, and teaching brands how to tell better stories, how to tell smarter stories, and build platforms that give their brand a voice, that give their brand a space, to have something to say and to create conversations that matter to their audience. So then I created IQ Labs as a company that's really designed to make people, brands and culture smarter through media, marketing, and education. So as we get into this, it will be broken into 3 lessons. So the first lesson will be all about identifying the opportunity, right? Where is the opportunity? What is the void? What is the space that you can fill? And this is ultimately where you're testing your product market fit. The second lesson is all about shaping the brand story. So now that you've seen the void, you've seen the opportunity, how do you start to shape the story of your brand, right? And then lastly, once you've shaped your brand story, it's about breaking into the market. It's about, putting your story into the open and really being able to connect with people and build community around that story. Right? So there's a few key terms to remember as we go throughout. Terms like culture, convergence, ethos, storytelling. These are things that you should know as a storyteller, as a marketer, as somebody who understands the space as you're building your small business. Then we move into other terms such as content, context, subculture, shared values. What I mean by smart, right? So smart being storytelling or messaging that is driven by real data, proven insights, and lived experience. And then lastly, we have terms like thematic programming and platform, right? So these are just terms to remember as we are going throughout. Right, so where are we today? Let's look at the climate that we're in today. So in the space we're in today, success starts with story, right? What do I mean by that? So the convergence of media, marketing, and technology has completely changed the way brands are built in the modern world, right? It's changed what brands look like. It's changed what brands have to say. And ultimately, in a digital era that's dominated by social media, brands express their value and their perspective through storytelling, which ultimately makes storytelling or content the language that brands use to communicate to consumers and culture today. Right? So then knowing that content or storytelling is the language that brands use to communicate, then what is the function of story? So the first key function of story is it builds authentic connections. So whether you as an entrepreneur, if your small business aspires to be, the next top tech giant, a leading lifestyle brand, or a global consumer product brand, connecting with consumers starts with understanding the nuances that shape who they are, right? Understanding their values, their needs, their wants, right? Their interests, their lifestyles. So when you understand these things, it allows you to build an authentic, deep-rooted, and lasting connection. The next function of story is translating shared values, right? So once you understand what your audience values and who they are and what their identity is, then you can compare that and evaluate your values, as the founder, as the leader, and as the company. What your company values, what your brand or product symbolizes, and then you can see where they intersect, right? And then you use story to translate or communicate that shared value. Again, when we think about people, right? When you connect with somebody and you meet them, we all have a story, right? We all share that story. So it's about seeing the common ground, the commonality, and where the two intersect. So then the next function of story is being the voice of your brand, right? What your brand has to say, how you have to say it, what perspective or unique point of view you have to offer, right? So effective storytelling shapes what we value, it shapes what we discuss, and it shapes the causes that we champion, right? So the stories you tell would directly reflect your attitude, your approach, and your unique perspective towards the topics that matter to your brand, right? So then story is also the spirit of your brand. This is very important. We talk a lot about ethos, which is key to the stories you tell and key to building a brand that really connects with people, right? So it's the stories speak directly to what drives you, right? What excites you and what ultimately challenges you. So it represents the spirit of your brand, of your company. And then story is the promise of your brand. This is very important, right? So you are in business to serve the consumer, right? To offer something of value to people. So your story is communicating that promise. It's communicating the commitment that you're making to the audience you serve to add real value to their lives, right? So when you think about the stories you tell, it's reinforcing why they should be engaged with you, why your brand or product is important to them, how it serves them, and it's holding you accountable to that, right? We talk a lot about accountability in storytelling now as well. So story represents the promise of your brand. So then now that we understand these things, right, the function of story, then it goes into something that I call the identity ecosystem. So these buckets represent the key elements that shape someone's identity, right? So first you would start with the values. So what do you value? Somebody may value their time, they value their family, they value their money, they value their health, right? So everybody has a set of values. You can even go more intangible and say, I value honesty, I value loyalty, I value trust, but we all have a value system that is unique and personal to us. Then those values shape your interests, right? So if you value your health, then you're going to be interested in eating healthier food. You're going to be interested in, working out more. You're going to be interested in things that revolve around the fact that you value your health, right? So then the values flow into your interests, which ultimately shape your lifestyle. So if you're somebody who values good health, then you'll be interested in eating healthier and working out, which ultimately creates a lifestyle that's centered around healthier living, right? So then you see how these things flow into each other and ultimately create an identity ecosystem for your consumers. So moving through, now we have the smart ecosystem, right? So when I say smart, what it ultimately means is driven by data, driven by insight, driven by real time lived experience. So first, it starts with information. You want to be able to collect as much hard information and hard data as possible, right? This could be market research. This could be you on Google, searching your market, the consumers that are in your market, really doing your homework to gather and collect as much information as possible. That information helps lead you into the insight, right? So you take that information, now you know what questions to ask, you know what people to connect with and ask and see, and gain real insight around your audience. So then once you have the information and you can develop and gather insight, it leads into developing a sharper and stronger instinct. So you have this information that's then shaped by insight, like real perspective, real experience, real understanding, and then that shapes the ability to know and have a better filter of, what's going to resonate, what works, what doesn't work, where do we miss the mark, right? What things should we tap into more when you think about the stories and the ideas and the campaigns that you have? When you think about this ecosystem, it allows you to pressure test and know what will work and won't and what will not. Right? So then we go into the content ecosystem. So the content ecosystem is really about how do these things come into play when we think about story. So it starts with the content, right? It starts with the story. It's any story or message that can be translated on any medium, right? It could be an email, it can be a text message, it can be editorial, it can be video. So it all starts with the content. That content being rooted in these values and interests and lifestyles, and going back to the identity ecosystem, right? If you use that with the smart ecosystem to start to shape the type of content and stories you tell, that goes into fueling and creating conversation, right? So the content you create, the stories you tell will spark, advance, and create new conversations. And then those conversations ultimately fuel culture, right? So when we think of culture as a community or a group of people who are united by these shared values and interests, and this can be, niche culture, a subculture, right? Or it can be pop culture, but the conversations ultimately shape what the culture is talking about, what people collectively care about and are talking about. So then you think about this ecosystem and how it blends into each other. We go into how does this ecosystem work, right? So smart and effective storytelling gives brands the ability to start, sustain, and scale impactful ideas across categories. So what do I mean by that, right? If we go into it a little deeper, the content fuels the conversation. So your stories create, they control, they advance the conversations that matter. Then those conversations fuel culture, right? So the conversations shape what we value, what we discuss, and the causes that we support. And then the culture fuels commerce, which is the most important piece, right? So the cultural trends, the shifts, the moments that matter, they dictate the brands, the products, and the experiences that consumers ultimately champion, right? So then when we think about all of this, it proves the point, right? It brings us to the fact that smarter stories drive better business results, right? So it's not just about, being able to connect and build the relationship and build community with your audience. At the end of the day, it creates a better strategy for growing and building your business, right? And being effective in how you reach people. So when you blend the data with cultural insights and the shared values, it helps you develop stories that build deeper brand loyalty, credibility, and ultimately conversion, right? And why is that? Because it's more authentic. Consumers will trust and believe the stories you tell. It's more relatable, so consumers will feel a deep-rooted connection to the stories that you tell. It's also more impactful, right? So consumers are inspired or empowered by the stories that you tell. And lastly, it's simply more effective, right? So consumers are driven or inspired to take action, right? Whether that's the action you want them to take in their lives, whether it's the action to make a purchase, the action to learn more and explore more, you've intrigued them and engaged them in a way that makes them want to take action, which is ultimately what real influence is. So when you think of a brand that has influence, a brand that is effective is a brand that can inspire consumers to take real action, right? So when you look at all of this, it is the key to driving better business results for your small business. So then a few distinctions to make, right? So the difference between marketing and promoting, right? So promoting, when we think about it, it's pitching your brand or product to the public. It's telling everybody, hey, you need to buy this, you need to have this. Marketing is about strategically positioning your brand or product within the market, right? So the difference between marketing and promoting is the difference between pitching to the public and positioning within your respective industry or market. So an example, if a promoter gets 10,000 people to show up to an event, right, but the event doesn't happen or the event is terrible, they are still a successful promoter, right? They did their job and they did it really well. They got everybody to show up, but it was not about the promise or the quality, of the actual product or the service that you had to offer. Then also getting into cultural versus lifestyle marketing, right? So we've heard a lot about cultural marketing, and we're moving into a time that's more driven by lifestyle marketing, right? So consumers need to see how your product or service fits seamlessly into their lifestyle. And bringing these up, these are all things that you communicate through your story, right? So consumers also want to know how your product or service solves real problems or adds tangible value to their lives. So an example of this, right? So marketing has evolved from simply proving how well your brand or product connects to culture to now being about how does your brand or product enhance the lives of your consumers. Then lastly, before we get into lesson one, we talk about context is king, right? So it assigns distinct meaning, it frames the stories that you tell, it establishes the common ground, and it ultimately assures that your stories translate with your target audience. So people say content is king. Context is really king because that's how you signal specifically to the audience you're looking to connect with, right? So then we go into lesson one. Now that we have the backdrop and the context, we step into lesson one, which is all about identifying the opportunity. So how do you test your product market fit? How do you see what the real opportunity and the real value is, the real void is in your market? And ultimately how you can use that to shape smarter stories and build a better brand narrative, right? So the first thing to do is ask yourself the key questions. So it's about doing a thorough evaluation of the key elements that really reflect how your brand is viewed, expressed and positioned within your respective industry. So you really want to ask yourself these key questions. First, what is your singular brand truth, right? What is your singular brand truth? These are all questions that ultimately would go into a brief, right? Like a creative brief or a brand brief that would be all about, building your platform and building your story. So what is your singular brand truth? So a few questions underneath that are, what does your brand symbolize? right? When people see your brand, when they see your logo, what does that embody? Two, what do people believe about your brand? So what do people believe? Not what you want them to believe, but what do people believe about your brand? Then how does your brand show up in people's lives? We talked about lifestyle marketing, right? People want to know how it adds real value or really enhances their lives. And then what mission, cause, or movement does your brand stand for? So if you looked at your small business, if you looked at your company, what does it stand for? What does it stand on? And what does that represent to your audience? Do you share the same, causes and missions that your audience shares? Right? So then what unique value does your brand or product add to your industry? So what gives you and your team a competitive advantage? What makes you or your team best equipped to be successful? What does your brand or product offer that doesn't currently exist, right? Then what impact do you see your brand or product having on your particular space or your industry? So what unique value does your brand or product add to your industry? Then what is a problem only your brand or product can solve, right? So real, successful, impactful companies solve real problems or fill real voids, right? Or add real value that is missing. So what is a problem only your brand or product can solve? So what is the opportunity that inspired you to create your company? So then it comes back to your story. What consumer needs are being ignored or underserved? What new spaces do you anticipate creating with your small business? What are the primary issues that matter to your audience that also resonate strongly with you as the founder, as a leader, and as the brand in the company? And then what voids are your brand or product uniquely positioned to fill, right? So what are the most commonly overlooked areas of your industry? How will you get it right where others have got it wrong? What consumer needs are being ignored or underserved? What causes or topics are you passionate about addressing that matter to your audience, right? So things you want to directly address. And then what new spaces are your brand or product uniquely positioned to create? So what key consumer segments remain underserved or unaccounted for? What untapped conversations should be had amongst you and your audience? What stories are missing that reflect your consumer segment, right? So when we think about your brand being a person and sharing your story, sharing your brand story, there are conversations and segments of the audience that you have deeper connections and relationships with, right? So it's really tapping into that. Then how will your brand or product shift the landscape of your industry? And then after you've asked these questions, it gets into discovering your artist, right? Discovering your audience. So emphasizing discover. When you think about discover, a lot of times brands or entrepreneurs, they predict or assume or project who they believe their audience is, right? They think about certain aspects of their brand or certain, elements of their product or their offering, and they want to just predict and throw out who they believe their audience is. But it's really about discovering them, right? When you know your brand, you know your identity as a company, it's about discovering who your audience really is. It might be an audience that you didn't know that you were connected to, or you didn't know existed, or you didn't understand how to really tap into, that you align with seamlessly. So then develop consumer archetypes that are rooted in your brand values, interests, and truths. So these are basically creating archetypes or case studies of who are these different members of this audience, right? So what do they care about? Who are they? What do they like? What do they do? And being able to create these archetypes. And then using CRM to identify the values and interests and lifestyles of your primary audience. And then identify the shared values and interests that connect you with these consumer segments. And then lastly, identify the relevant keywords, the cultural trends, and the conversations that are actively shaping these consumer segments, right? So you want to know, what conversations are they having, right? What trends are they following or shaping or tapped into, And then also understanding what keywords. So when you think about, what are topics or themes or, words that continuously pop up with this audience, it's being able to tap into them and shape and build story around them. So we're moving into the next lesson. So lesson 2, right? So you understand who your brand is, what type of conversations you want to have, what type of stories you want to tell. You're understanding and discovering who your audience is. So now that you have these elements of, I know who my brand, I know what my brand represents, I know who I am as a business, I understand who my audience is, I understand what they care about, what matters to them. I see where the shared value and connection in that is. I also understand the conversations, the trends, the experiences that are shaping my consumer segment. It leads us into the next lesson and the next step in the process, which is shaping the brand story, right? So you, again, as the entrepreneur, as a small business owner, you have a story, right? And it's great and it's effective and it's smart to tap into that story. People want to know, why you uh, founded this company, what opportunity you saw, what void did you want to fill, right? We talked about these questions that you ask yourself. What unique opportunity you saw in the market to bring this to life and how you're uniquely positioned to bring that to life. But then your brand, right, also has a story. And humanizing your brand, it's thinking about what is the story your brand wants to tell and how do you shape your narrative, right? Everything starts with narrative. We mentioned success starts with story. So this is all about how you shape that, right? And it's controlling your narrative and creating a North Star from which all of your stories come from. We talked about ethos, the spirit of your brand, right? It's a platform, it's a foundation from which all of your stories derive from. So first thing to remember is brands work for the people, right? So consumers are people before they become customers. Consumers have real needs, real problems, and real desires. Consumers are actively searching for brands and products that intentionally serve them, right? So you see me, you recognize me, you know what I need, you know what I want. You uniquely fill that void or offer that value, right? Or meet that need, and you intentionally are serving me, right? And story is a huge part of communicating that and building that connection. So we're shifting from a time of content as entertainment to content as utility, like content as a service, story as a service. So people want to receive content and stories that add real value, allow them to take the next step in their life, in their career, allow them to solve real problems, meet their real needs, right? So we're shifting to a time where content and story is used as a service. So then smart storytelling is anchored in developing that deep-rooted human connection with the audiences that you serve, right? So then we talked about owning the ethos, owning the spirit of your brand. So the best brands in the world are not companies themselves. They are the spirit from which great companies are born, right? So it's not the company itself, it's the spirit from which it is born. So expressing the spirit of your brand establishes a consistent and powerful through line that connects all of your products, experiences, and stories to one singular focus. So when you think about the ethos, that's the center, right? That's the spirit, that's the why, that's the foundation from which all of your stories are inspired. So when we look at a few examples, right? When you think about Nike, Nike represents the spirit of athletes who aspire to excellence. So regardless of what product they put out, regardless of what sport or what athlete they're covering, all of the stories they tell, if you watch their commercials, if you see their campaigns, they all represent the spirit of athletes who aspire to excellence. Serena Williams, LeBron James, Derek Jeter, all of these athletes who represent greatness and excellence, right? That's what Nike embodies. That's their spirit, and they own that. Red Bull represents the spirit of athletes with an appetite for the extreme. When you think about Red Bull, that's what you think about. You think about somebody who jumps, out of a rocket ship in space and comes down. You think about somebody who rides their bike straight down a mountain. You think about athletes with an appetite for the extreme. That's the spirit of Red Bull, and they own that, and all of their stories reflect that. Think about Apple, right? The spirit of people who want a simple and connected life, right? We're all complex. We all have so much going on, and we just want life to be simple, and we want to be connected to everything that we care about. So Apple represents the spirit of people who want a simple and connected life. And then lastly, you think about Adidas, right? From creators to athletes. Adidas represents the spirit of athletes and creators who defy convention, right? People like your Pharrells, right? People who represent being unconventional, being somebody who shatters tradition, somebody who doesn't do it the normal way or like the status quo. So these are the spirits of these specific brands and what they represent, and each of these brands owns that spirit. So for you, you would think about what is the spirit of my brand, because that's at the heart of shaping your brand story. So what is the spirit of your brand? If you were to put it in a singular sentence, what does it represent? Like, my brand represents the spirit of what? And being able to come to an answer that you can stand on and that your brand truly represents and embodies, right? So then bringing this back, because this is a key point to make this distinction, right, in your mind. The best brands in the world are not companies. They are the foundation or the spirit from which great companies are born. So all of the stories you tell, when you think about the ethos of the brand, the spirit you're expressing, that's also the spirit or the emotion that people are connected to. So people who share that same spirit, that same emotion, that same feeling, they tap into that. That's what they connect to. So you send that and express that. That's who you connect with and attract in return, right? So then controlling your narrative. So creating these core components that we spoke about of your brand identity provides a solid foundation and lays the groundwork for telling smart, engaging, and impactful stories across platforms, right? So this is an exercise for you. This is something that I do all the time when I'm working with brands and helping to develop brands at every level, from small business to bigger global companies, bigger brands. It's very simple, right? You want to do your homework and write out the foundation of your story, right? So these elements are the foundation of your brand story. First is your mission, right? Your why. We talk a lot about your why. Why does this product exist? Why does this brand exist? Why did you create it, right? Bringing it down to one singular mission. So develop a clear and concise mission statement to establish your brand ethos. And we're going to get into a case study of these elements in a second. 2, your position. Develop a positioning statement. So how your brand or product is uniquely positioned in the market. Develop a positioning statement that establishes how your brand is uniquely set up for success, right? And then your philosophy, right? Every leader has a philosophy. Every brand has a philosophy, right? So then develop a brand manifesto or philosophy that gives context. It gives context, intention. Sorry, it was hard to see. Context, intention, and focus to the stories that you tell. And then lastly, create your storyline, right? So if you thought about it through the lens of somebody reporting or telling your story, you can use CRM, right? You can use your customer relationship management tool to develop campaigns and storylines that speak directly to the shared values and interests of your audience. So when you know what they are, you can create that storyline of, we serve people in this way. This is, the story that we're telling about ourselves to the public and to our consumers, right? So this is how you take control and control your narrative and create a foundation to tell all of your stories across platforms, right? So then here's a quick case study. Illy Mag, so I Love You Mag. This is a media company and a magazine that was created by a brilliant young lady named Erica Martinez, right? So this will go into a few of the elements that we just spoke about when it comes to controlling your narrative, right? Like you tell the first story about yourself to people, right? You express that. So then we get into it, right? You look at the elements of who we are. So I Love You, Illy Mag is a lifestyle platform that explores how people define, express, and experience love. In short, we explore how people define, express, and experience love. So it's very clear, it's very to the point. This is who we are, right? So then what do we do? Through multimedia storytelling and immersive experiences, Illy Mag aims to create, facilitate, and advance conversations around the world's most complicated word. So then you have the who we are, this is what we do. Ultimately, this is our mission. Then you have how we're positioned, right? So then you move into Our positioning, so founded in 2016, Illy is an independent media and marketing company that specializes in exploring how today's generation defines, expresses, and experiences love. We tell modern love stories in a variety of formats, from digital covers, featured editorial, and original videos to multimedia campaigns and immersive events. IllyMag inspires people to expand their definition of love while simplifying their understanding of it, right? So when you paint this picture, you let people know how you are uniquely positioned as a platform, as a brand. People can identify with the shared values, the shared needs, the shared interests, right? So then you go into what is love. So this is more of your philosophy or your manifesto. So for a platform that is representing, exploring how people express and experience love, how a digital generation defines love. So then what is the philosophy or the manifesto or ultimately the thinking behind how you're going to explore that, right? So love is complicated. It's a four-letter word with the power to amplify our greatest strengths and expose our biggest weaknesses. It's a complex emotion capable of heightening our self-confidence and affirming our beliefs while awakening our deepest fears and insecurities. It can be a gateway to uncovering our purpose, inspiring our best ideas, and fueling our passions. It can also be a path to dysfunction, disappointment, and self-destruction. Love shapes how we see ourselves, how we see each other, and how we engage with the world around us. Yet, regardless of how we handle the the trials and triumphs of living with it, love is a variable we all can't live without. So whether a hopeless romantic, a jaded skeptic, or an undercover lover, I Love You or Illy provides a platform for real people to share their true love story, right? So now you understand the way that the brand is going to tell stories around love, with love being at the center, with the ethos being, we represent the spirit of people who desire to understand love better and define love for themselves, right? So then lastly, love, it's complicated. So this is developing your storyline, right? So now that you have your philosophy, you have your mission statement, this is who we are, this is what we do, this is how we think, right? So then you get into the actual storyline that you create for yourself. So in this case, love, it's complicated. This is telling our story, right? So in today's digital era, people feel more connected than ever. Mobile devices give millions immediate access to become fans, followers, or friends in real time from anywhere in the world. From direct messaging to dating apps, strangers become lovers after a simple like or a swipe to the right. While this shift has redefined the mechanics of building relationships, it has also rewritten the playbook for finding love, creating new rules, new standards, and new expectations. However, despite a changing climate, the fundamental principles of love still apply. For those accustomed to following tradition, navigating the internet to find the right one can be more challenging than ever. For a digital generation seeking genuine emotional ties, finding a real bond can be an uphill battle. This presents the need for a platform that truthfully explores all aspects of love from the people who are experiencing it. So you see there, you created the context, you provided context, you provided the climate, you showed the void, you showed the opportunity, you showed where you stand in that, and ultimately you show what need are you offering, what void are you filling, and how you're going to do that, right? And you're doing it all through telling your story and framing the narrative yourself, framing your brand story. And then ultimately from all of this, you have a boilerplate and a foundation from which you can create, editorial, videos, real-time conversations out of this story that you've created for yourself. So the brand narrative you created can drive everything else that you do, right? So then out of that, you have your tagline, right? So love, it's complicated. So from your story, from that storyline derives the tagline, right? Think about love, it's complicated. So then the one-liner of that, redefining love for a digital generation. Like that's the core, the clear, one-liner of what we do. Okay, so lastly, moving into lesson 3, breaking into the market. So now, you've taken the time to identify the product market fit, the void you fill, the value you offer, where the shared values are with your audience. You've discovered who that audience is. You know what they care about. You know how to connect with them. Then you've taken a step to use that information and insight and use that instinct to shape your brand story, right? To shape your own narrative as a company, to shape the stories you want to tell. You know your why, you're owning your ethos. You understand what conversations matter, what conversations you want to tap into. So now it's all about breaking into the market, right? So how do you bring this to life? How do you bring these stories to life and ultimately use those stories to effectively market your company, right? So the first thing you want to do is develop a singular go-to-market platform and campaign, right? A singular go-to-market platform and campaign. So once you've taken inventory of your brand and you've done the work, the groundwork that we went through to lay out, what is your story, what is your spirit, what is your philosophy, your manifesto, etc. You framed your story, right? So now develop a singular go-to-market platform and campaign that's inspired by that, right? So the platform itself, when we say platform in this context, it's all about what is the singular message or theme that is inspiring the stories you're going to tell, right? Like what is the symbolism or the representation that you want all of your content to represent, right? And you'll use your data, insights, and your brand positioning to create a smart and impactful tagline, a brand statement, and thematic programming, which ultimately means thematic stories that matter and introduce your brand into the market, right? So this is a big piece of making the first entry point, right? So then from there, you want to develop a cross-platform content strategy. So a story-driven strategy, content strategy across all of your platforms and mediums, right? So we talked about creating a through line, how the platform and the spirit of your brand will create a consistent and powerful through line. So you want to use that through line to thread the stories you're going to tell across platforms that are all inspired by this singular theme or this singular topic that you're going to explore, right? So you're going to create a cohesive content rollout plan that clearly communicates your campaign message through multimedia storytelling that translates your brand perspective and expresses your shared values and interests across platforms. Then you're going to develop a story-driven brand communication strategy. So you've developed a singular campaign in the platform, right? Then you moved on from there and you said, okay, how do I express this campaign idea, this platform concept across my different platforms, right? Through storytelling. Then you develop a story-driven brand communication strategy, which essentially is a story-driven PR strategy, right? So how do you want to translate your story through other outlets, right? Like what are the shared values and interests and topics that connect you with particular outlets that relate to your story? And you want to be intentional and specific about that. Like what pieces of your story make sense to share with what outlets? What are the headlines? And then ultimately, what do those stories represent to your audience? And how do you connect that back to your brand and get the equity from that, right? So identify key topics, themes, and conversations inspired by your campaign message to create a targeted PR and brand communications plan anchored in storylines that intentionally highlight different aspects of your brand story. And lastly, you want to use CRM to create relevant content that engages your audience and fuels the ecosystem. So we talked about the brand ecosystem, the content ecosystem. So you want to use CRM to create relevant content or relevant stories that engage your audience and fuel this ecosystem. So you want to leverage real-time consumer insights, real-time cultural trends, and behavioral patterns to craft cross-platform stories or cross-platform content that creates conversations, builds community, drives engagement, and leads to scalable conversions, right? So the more people you connect with, we talked about how story drives better business results. It's more effective, it's more authentic, it's more relatable, right? It's more empowering and impactful in that respect. So that when you do this correctly across platforms and you really use this data, this information, and this insight, you're able to create or lead to scalable conversions. So here's a case study as we wrap up the third lesson, right? Luck Belaire. So Luck Belaire is a family-owned, independent spirits brand, right? So it's owned by Sovereign Brands. Sovereign Brands owns a variety of portfolio of brands. Belaire is one of them. Belaire was launched in 2012 by Brett Bears, who is one of the family members. He's carried the company on through generations. And now it's an award-winning line of French sparkling wines. And their signature black bottles have evolved into a symbol of self-made success. So we talk about, what does your brand embody, right? And how do you establish that through the stories that you tell? What is your ethos? So in this particular case, you have a family-owned independent spirits brand that wanted to stay independent. And it was all about how do we translate or express the spirit of independence, the spirit of being self-made, because we take pride in that with our audience and create and use storytelling to make our brand synonymous with being independent and being self-made. So then the bottle became the symbol of self-made success, right? Through telling these self-made stories of artists, right? And it started out with, having Post Malone, Russ, DJ Khaled, Rick Ross, as more of them shared their self-made stories, Nipsey Hussle, it just became every artist who, believed they were self-made and independent and paved their own path wanted to be associated with it, right? They wanted to share their self-made story. And then those stories helped elevate the brand to become this symbol. So the black bottle, when people, carry Belaire, they have it, or you see the artists or the entrepreneurs, the people associated with it, they carry that with pride and say, I'm self-made, I did it my way. And that was all done through storytelling and implementing the strategy and process we just went through. So I'm going to take you through it. So in just 5 years, the brand Belaire Rosé became the top-selling French sparkling wine in the United States, and now Belaire stands as the fastest selling, the highest selling sparkling wine in the world right now. So then you have self-made tastes better, right? So it tastes better when you do it yourself. It tastes better when you pave your own path, all right? So keeping with that ethos, what came out of that was the concept of, okay, being self-made tastes better. It feels better, right? It means more. So that is a through line or an ethos that so many people can relate to, right? Or identify with. Anybody who feels like, I worked hard, I've earned what I have, I'm pursuing my dream, I'm building my business, I'm building my brand up, and I'm doing it my way, I'm pushing through. That's ultimately what this singular platform and campaign became. So that's what you're seeing here, right? Self-Made Tastes Better became the platform and the flagship series. So by doing this, telling the self-made story, Self-Made Tastes Better became the flagship video series of artists sharing their self-made stories, right? So you have the platform, the singular campaign being Self-Made Tastes Better, and then you have the first strategy when we talk about cross-platform of launching an original video series of artists sharing their self-made stories, right? So then you have the original video series you see here, Self-Made Season 1 with Post Malone, then you see the playlist, and it became an episodic series that continued to grow as more artists wanted to tell their story. So now more audiences are being exposed to this messaging, are being connected to it, which is ultimately, raising visibility and awareness for the brand, for the product, which is ultimately driving more purchases and more orders, right? And more awareness around that. People want the bottle, they want Belaire, they want to feel and be self-made. So the original video series tapped into that and people sharing their self-made stories. So then from there, right, cross-platform, we talk about the other element of storytelling being original editorial. So when we launched Self-Made Tastes Better, the video series, I had my column at Forbes, and we created, I thought it would be great for these artists, not only to just share their story, their self-made story, but to teach the mechanics of it and show the art of being self-made, because there's so many entrepreneurs and creators and other artists who, want to follow the blueprint, want to learn, want to be engaged. Again, this comes down to storytelling that offers real value, that really serves people, that really enhances their lives, right? And enhances their lifestyle. So we launched the Art of Self-Made series, which became a separate editorial series through my Forbes column. So this was, in addition to the videos, artists like you see here, Steve Aoki and Nipsey Hussle, like sharing the mechanics of how they built their careers, how they remained self-made and built their business, right? So then from that, we talk about the story within the story, right? So a story-driven comm strategy, a story-driven PR strategy. So here you see to the left, you have Sovereign Brand CEO Brett Berish is building a self-made spirits empire. So this is stepping out and knowing that this is the CEO, which you are the CEO of your company, the leader of your company, the entrepreneur. So this is, again, an example of sharing your story and how important your story is and how your story reflects directly to the brand, right? And going back to the very beginning of, we all are a brand, whether we choose to be or not, right? It's what, how people experience us, what we represent, what we symbolize. So in this case, Brett Berish being the CEO and the leader of Sovereign Brands and Belaire, this is him sharing his self-made story and speaking about the history and the story of the brand and why it makes perfect sense that he's launched, this product into the marketplace that represents being self-made. Then here you have the story within the story, right? Knowing that there are gems from people sharing their own, path to success. You have DJ Khaled went from sleeping in his car to earning millions. Here's the first big purchase he made. Getting into lifestyle and human interest of, okay, we know Khaled is big, we know what he's done, but here's another glimpse into his story, and it all points back to self-made, right? It's getting the equity back from the stories that you tell, and it's feeding that ecosystem, right? So you see the original video series, which is then fueling into the editorial series, which then goes into the story-driven PR strategy, right? Or the comm strategy, where you're consistently and continually using story to build brand equity, to drive real business results, to build community, to drive engagement. And it's all rooted in story that is serving your audience, like recognizing what they want, what they aspire to, what they need, and being able to fuel that ecosystem, right? And we are wrapped. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. I know this is new. This is new for me. This is a new experience. So I appreciate you rocking with me, going throughout the presentation. I hope it was helpful, insightful, informative to you. You can ask me any. I know we had questions that we just answered, but if you want to follow up at All Things Mitch on Twitter, on Instagram, feel free to drop me a question or drop me a note. Make sure you also use the hashtag Magenta Edge if you are on Twitter. Anything that stood out to you, any questions you may have, make sure you use the hashtag. Also, I mentioned every week, every Thursday for 8 weeks, there will be a new course. So you have another course next Thursday, some really incredible entrepreneurs and small business owners sharing their insight. You can go to tmobile.com/Magenta Edge to see the schedule, see the topics, and register for those courses. So a big shout out to everybody involved for putting this together. And it was a pleasure. My name is Julian Mitchell, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.